The most unsettling moment with a narcissist is not always the rage, the criticism, or the moment they walk away dramatically. Sometimes the most painful moment is when everything suddenly becomes silent, as if you were erased from their world overnight. When a narcissist reaches this stage, they may not return to explain themselves, offer an apology, or even create another painful conflict. They simply disappear emotionally. Many people fail to recognize what this silence means until the connection has already ended. If you have experienced that strange emptiness after the chaos, that feeling of wondering why silence hurt more than the arguments ever did, understanding this moment can become a major part of your healing. Because when the illusion finally breaks, what falls apart is not your strength. It is the false reality you were holding on to. When a narcissist is truly finished with someone, it often does not happen with the dramatic ending people imagine. There may not be a final confrontation, a passionate argument, or an emotional goodbye. In many cases, the loudest forms of rejection are actually signs that emotions are still active. Anger, revenge, insults, blocking, public accusations, and sudden attempts to hurt you are all emotional responses. They show that some level of emotional involvement still exists. But when the narcissist has completely shifted away, the change feels much quieter and much more confusing. It can feel like you are standing in a familiar place, but all the lights have suddenly been turned off. One moment you feel like you are the center of their attention, and the next, they behave as though you were never significant. This type of silent withdrawal often happens when the narcissist no longer receives the emotional response they once depended on. Maybe you stopped arguing. Maybe you stopped trying to prove your side. Maybe you stopped chasing answers or reacting to their behavior. When the emotional supply they expected is no longer available, the interaction loses its value for them. They may no longer see a reason to continue the cycle because the emotional reward has disappeared. Conflict requires effort, and when the outcome no longer benefits them, they may choose distance instead. This silence is not necessarily a sign of emotional maturity or personal growth. It is often a sign of complete disengagement. The connection is no longer providing what they once sought, so they remove themselves from the situation. The most painful part is that this type of departure rarely comes with an explanation. There is usually no honest conversation where everything is acknowledged and every question is answered. Closure requires self-reflection, emotional responsibility, and the ability to recognize another person's experience. Instead, the narcissist may simply reduce contact, stop responding, and disappear from the patterns you once knew. The calls, messages, and familiar interactions slowly vanish or end without warning. From their perspective, they may believe there is nothing left to discuss because they have already moved emotionally in another direction. They have already detached internally, even while you are still trying to understand what happened. This is why the silent ending can sometimes feel more painful than obvious mistreatment. During conflict, there is at least something visible to respond to. There are words, actions, and behaviors that your mind can process. But silence creates a space filled with unanswered questions. You begin searching for reasons. You replay old conversations. You wonder if you misunderstood the relationship or if you somehow caused the ending. You may start questioning your own value and asking whether the connection was ever real. This confusion happens because your mind is trying to create a story where there is a missing chapter. The sudden disappearance leaves you without a clear ending. At the same time, this quiet exit can allow the narcissist to protect their own image because leaving without accountability allows them to avoid difficult conversations and responsibility. Emotional distance can often feel more final than anger, cruelty, or dramatic rejection because anger still represents involvement. When someone is furious, they are still emotionally activated. When they criticize, blame, threaten, or attempt to punish, they are still focused on your reaction. They still want something from the interaction, whether it is control, validation, fear, or attention. Even negative attention requires a connection. If your actions can still trigger a response from them, then you still hold some place inside their emotional world. Their anger may be painful, but it also reveals that you still have an impact on them. The emotional intensity keeps the connection alive, even if the connection is unhealthy. True detachment feels different because there is no emotional response left to reach. Your sadness does not move them. Your silence does not create curiosity. Your presence no longer gives them the same emotional energy they once received. This does not necessarily mean they have healed or become emotionally healthier. It can simply mean they have disconnected because they no longer see value in continuing the dynamic. Rage communicates that there is still conflict. Detachment communicates that the emotional investment has been removed. That is why it can feel so cold and confusing. Conflict gives your mind something to process, but emotional absence gives you nothing. The brain naturally searches for resolution through interaction, even when that interaction was painful. When the connection suddenly disappears, the attachment can remain active while the other person has already stepped away emotionally. You may still be searching for answers while they have already closed that chapter. Detachment can also serve as a way for the narcissist to protect their already fragile sense of self. Anger and conflict create risks because arguments can reveal contradictions, expose insecurity, and force them to face uncomfortable truths. Emotional withdrawal allows them to avoid those moments completely. By shutting down and disconnecting, they do not have to reflect on their behavior, acknowledge the pain they caused, or take responsibility for repairing the damage. They can move forward without ever confronting their own actions. In their mind, they may rewrite the relationship as something that was never important, rather than something that ended because of their choices. For the person left behind, this emotional cutoff can feel like being erased from existence. Not because the relationship had no meaning, but because the meaning and emotional investment may not have been shared in the same way. The silence delivers a painful message. Not that you were wrong, but that they no longer see a reason to keep you in their world. Indifference is often the clearest sign that the emotional connection has reached its final stage because it represents a complete withdrawal of investment. Cruel words, manipulation, and abandonment still require attention and emotional energy. They are active choices that involve engagement, even if that engagement is harmful. But indifference requires nothing. When a narcissist becomes truly indifferent, you no longer fulfill a role in their internal world. You are no longer someone they need to control, impress, punish, convince, or provoke. You simply stop being emotionally useful to them. This is why indifference can feel so painful and even dehumanizing. People naturally interpret emotional reactions as proof that a connection exists. Even anger shows that someone is still affected, but indifference removes every signal. There is no fight to win, no approval to gain, and no reaction to analyze. The emotional mirror disappears completely. This is also why many people describe this stage as a sudden emotional emptiness. There is no longer anger that you can respond to, affection that you can reach toward, or tension that you can try to resolve. Conversations, if they happen, may feel cold, brief, and purely functional. The warmth that once made you feel connected disappears, but so does the hostility that once caused fear. What remains is a strange emotional silence. However, this silence is not necessarily peace. It is simply the absence of emotional engagement. For many people recovering from a relationship with a narcissistic person, this stage can create a grief that feels even heavier than the conflict itself. Conflict can sometimes create the illusion that there is still something to save. Indifference forces you to face a more painful possibility that the emotional connection you were fighting for may not have existed in the same way for both people. The bond was real from your perspective, but their involvement may have been based more on what the relationship provided rather than genuine emotional reciprocity. Indifference can also function as a shield against self-examination. If they allowed themselves to care, even in a negative way, they might have to face uncomfortable emotions such as guilt, shame, or accountability. Emotional numbness allows them to avoid those feelings entirely. By mentally disconnecting from you, they can continue their life without fully processing the consequences of their actions. This is why searching for answers from someone who has entered this stage can often create more pain. You are looking for understanding from a person who may no longer be emotionally available to provide it. Their lack of response becomes the answer itself. Indifference is usually not something that can be negotiated away through more explanations, more patience, or more attempts to be understood. It often represents the point where the emotional connection has already ended on their side. Accepting that reality can be painful, but it can also become the moment where you begin rebuilding your own emotional foundation instead of waiting for someone else to validate your experience. A narcissist does not always stop engaging because they suddenly developed awareness, accountability, or emotional maturity. In many situations, the withdrawal happens because their attention has shifted toward another source of validation. This can be one of the hardest realities to accept because it challenges the hope that their silence means they are reflecting, missing you, or finally understanding what they lost. Often, their emotional patterns are based around what they receive from others. When one person stops providing admiration, reassurance, emotional reactions, or a sense of control, their focus may move toward another person who can provide those things. From the outside, this shift can appear sudden, but internally, it may have been happening for a long time before you noticed. The emotional distance may have started while you were still trying to repair the relationship, understand the problems, or restore the connection. A new source of attention does not necessarily have to be healthier, deeper, or more meaningful. It simply has to feel new. Newness creates excitement because the person has not yet established strong boundaries, questioned their behavior, or seen the parts they try to hide. In their perspective, a fresh connection can feel easier because the old conflicts and emotional history are not there yet. This is why the emotional cutoff can feel so shocking to the person left behind. You experience the disappearance as it happens, while they may have already been mentally distancing themselves for weeks or months. You are still trying to understand what changed, while they may have already redirected their emotional energy somewhere else. The most painful part is often the lack of visibility. There is no clear moment where everything ends. There is no final conversation that explains the transition. There is no single event you can point to and say, this was the exact moment it was over. Instead, there is only a gradual disappearance of the connection that once felt intense. The silence feels overwhelming because there is no ending to hold on to, no explanation to revisit, and no final words to analyze. But eventually, what first feels like abandonment can become information. Their absence reveals something about the nature of the connection and where their emotional investment truly existed. It shows you what you were carrying that was never meant to be carried alone. The pain of that realization can be deep, but clarity often begins there. Not when they return, not when they finally explain themselves, but when you understand that their disappearance was never proof that you lacked value. What feels like being erased is not evidence that you were meaningless. It is evidence that you are finally seeing the relationship without the illusion. It does not mean you were worthless or that the relationship meant nothing. It reveals that their way of connecting was fundamentally different from yours. You built attachment through emotional depth, shared memories, vulnerability, and genuine presence. They may have built attachment around what the relationship provided for them: emotional regulation, validation, attention, or a sense of control. When that purpose disappeared, their ability to stay emotionally connected changed as well. This difference can feel incredibly painful because you expected the same emotional process from them that you would experience yourself. But once you stop viewing their silence as proof of your inadequacy, you begin to recognize it as a reflection of their emotional limitations. Healing does not come from forcing them to explain what happened. It begins when you realize their silence has already communicated everything you need to know. You are not being abandoned because you failed to be enough. You are being released from a dynamic where your value is measured by what you provided. That distinction is powerful because it changes the entire way you see the ending. The same pattern explains why a narcissist can appear so calm after walking away. There may be no visible sadness, no obvious grief, and no signs that they are struggling with the loss. Their emotional attention may have already shifted somewhere else while you are still processing the disappearance, replaying memories, questioning conversations, and trying to understand how someone who once seemed so connected could become so distant. They may already be creating a new version of their life, repeating familiar patterns, presenting themselves as unchanged, and telling a story where they appear unaffected by what happened. What makes this transition so painful is that it often happens without honesty or explanation. Narcissists rarely announce that their emotional focus has moved elsewhere. Instead, you notice it through changes in behavior. The delayed responses, the lack of curiosity, the sudden emotional coldness, and the disappearance of effort become the only clues. If you ask directly, they may deny what is happening, dismiss your concerns, or act as if you are imagining things. Admitting that they have shifted their attention would require them to recognize a pattern within themselves, and that kind of self-awareness can threaten the image they work hard to maintain. It forces them to confront uncomfortable truths about how they connect with people, and many avoid that confrontation entirely. This is why trying to compete for their attention or prove your worth during this stage can become deeply damaging. You are no longer participating in a normal relationship dynamic where two people are trying to understand each other. You are trying to find security inside a system where your value was connected to the emotional role you fulfilled. Their decision to move away is not evidence that someone else is better than you or that you are easily replaceable as a person. It reveals how they manage their emotional needs. Once they find another way to receive what they were seeking, the attachment they showed before can disappear without the kind of emotional ending you expected. You are left processing a loss that they may have already experienced internally long before they physically walked away. This is also why closure is often missing when a narcissist has truly disconnected. Real closure requires acknowledging the impact of one person's actions on another. It requires honesty, accountability, and the willingness to admit that something meaningful happened. For a narcissist, that level of acknowledgement can challenge the story they tell themselves about who they are. Recognizing that they hurt someone, damaged a connection, or contributed to the ending can create emotions they may not want to face. Instead of offering understanding, they may choose distance. Instead of explaining, they choose silence. The absence of communication becomes a way to avoid responsibility while still moving forward without confronting the emotional consequences of their actions. This silence is not always accidental. It can serve a psychological purpose. By refusing to discuss the ending, they avoid uncomfortable conversations and leave you carrying the unanswered questions alone. Even after they leave, the imbalance continues. You are searching for meaning, trying to understand what changed, while they have already decided that no explanation is necessary. Many people mistake this behavior for confusion or emotional overwhelm, but often it is avoidance. A conversation about the ending would require reflection, and reflection can bring up guilt, shame, or accountability. Instead, they may ignore messages, avoid serious discussions, or provide vague responses that never fully address what happened. Sometimes the door is not completely closed. Instead, it is left slightly open. A message may receive a brief response. Occasional contact may appear. Small signs of attention may keep hope alive. This creates a painful emotional space where you are not fully together, but also not fully free. The mind naturally struggles with unfinished endings, so you may find yourself replaying conversations, imagining different outcomes, or waiting for one final explanation that will suddenly make everything clear. But closure from someone who refuses to acknowledge the emotional reality of the relationship often becomes impossible to obtain. Any explanation they provide may protect their own image rather than help you understand your experience. Without a shared ending, the narcissist can create their own version of the story. They may minimize what happened, reduce the importance of the connection, or present themselves as someone who simply moved on. Meanwhile, you are left trying to make sense of an experience that feels confusing and unreal. This lack of a clear ending can make the loss feel invalidating because there is no final moment where both people recognize what happened. But understanding that closure may never come from them is a painful but freeing realization. Their silence is not a mystery that requires endless investigation. It is information. The answers you are searching for cannot be forced from someone who has chosen emotional distance. When you stop waiting for them to provide the explanation you deserve, something begins to change inside you. You start creating your own understanding based on your reality rather than their absence. Your confusion does not mean you are weak or incapable of moving forward. It is the result of experiencing a sudden emotional shift that your mind was not prepared to process. When someone disappears without communication, your brain naturally tries to fill in the missing pieces. You are attempting to make sense of two conflicting realities: the person who once made you feel important, and the person who now acts as though you were never there. That contradiction creates emotional whiplash, but recognizing the pattern is often the first step toward reclaiming your peace. The emotional intensity that once felt so powerful and the emptiness that followed can create one of the most confusing experiences to process. This confusion becomes even stronger when you realize that the relationship itself may have been shaped by inconsistency. There may have been moments of deep attention, affection, closeness, and validation, followed by periods of withdrawal, criticism, coldness, or emotional distance. Over time, your nervous system begins adapting to that unpredictability. You become highly aware of small changes in their behavior. A different tone of voice, a delayed response, or a slight shift in their mood can start feeling significant. You learn to search for signs of disconnection and focus on repairing the bond whenever you sense it weakening. Your mind becomes trained to restore the connection because losing it feels threatening. When the narcissist eventually disconnects completely, that internal system does not immediately shut down. Your mind and body may continue operating as if the next emotional shift is still coming. You may wait for a message, a sudden return, another argument, or some form of explanation. You remain prepared for the next moment of tension or reconciliation, but nothing happens. The silence continues, and strangely, that silence can feel more overwhelming than the conflicts that came before it. The absence itself becomes the thing your nervous system reacts to. You are still emotionally activated, but the person who created that activation is no longer present. This creates an internal conflict where your body is searching for a resolution that may never arrive. Many people interpret this experience as proof that they are still deeply attached or that they are unable to let go. But often what remains is not simply love or attachment. It is the emotional conditioning created by unpredictability. You became used to adjusting yourself, explaining yourself, fixing problems, and staying emotionally available in order to bring back moments of connection. Your mind learned that if you tried harder, understood more, or changed something about yourself, the relationship might return to a safer place. When the relationship suddenly ends, there is no longer a problem to solve and no reaction to manage. So the mind begins searching for answers internally. You start questioning your memories, your judgment, and even your own perception of what happened. You may find yourself asking whether the connection was ever genuine, whether you missed something important, or whether you were responsible for the way things ended. These thoughts can feel like deep self-reflection, but many times they are actually signs of emotional confusion after a destabilizing experience. Your mind is trying to organize something that did not follow the normal patterns of a secure relationship. Meanwhile, the narcissist may not be experiencing the same confusion because their process is not based on understanding the ending in the same emotional way. They may not be searching for meaning or trying to reconcile both sides of the story. They may have simply disconnected and moved forward. This difference creates a painful imbalance between two people experiencing the same ending in completely different ways. One person is left trying to understand a story that suddenly stopped without a conclusion, while the other has already mentally moved into a different chapter. This is why confusion can sometimes become stronger after the relationship ends rather than while it is happening. During the relationship, the constant emotional activity keeps your attention focused on managing the connection. There is always something to respond to, fix, explain, or prepare for, but when that stimulation disappears, your mind finally has space to process everything that happened. Without the familiar cycle of conflict and repair, your thoughts turn inward and begin searching for clarity. The problem is that clarity is difficult to find when the foundation of the relationship was built around inconsistency rather than emotional security. You are trying to understand the experience through the perspective of mutual care, shared responsibility, and emotional partnership. But if the connection was not truly balanced, that framework may not explain what happened. You are searching for logic inside a dynamic that may have operated according to completely different rules. Your confusion does not mean you are incapable of accepting reality. It means you are attempting to make sense of something that created a powerful emotional bond while also creating uncertainty and instability. Recognizing that difference can be the beginning of freeing yourself from the endless search for answers that may never come from the person who created the confusion in the first place.